Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for attending today, and I'd like to welcome the people who are here in person and also those online. So what I'd like to do just to begin with is to particularly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the people of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to particularly pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal people who are here and in person or online. So the session today is bail and remand post-release, or carceral continuum. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Emma, has come down with COVID, so we're really sorry to hear that. Fortunately, she's going to be able to listen in, but we will very much miss her and we wish her all the best. Is by Gabriela Franich. And let me just give a bit of an intro to Gabriela. She's a PhD student in criminology at the University of Melbourne. She is an anti-carceral feminist criminologist, and her research focuses on women's experiences of prison and the challenges faced by support workers in the punitive criminal legal system. Gabby has worked and volunteered in campaign and advocacy spaces for currently and formerly incarcerated women since 2017. What she learns from women with lived experience of prison significantly influences her approach to research and teaching. So thank you. I'll hand over to Gabby.
Thank you guys so much.
Need a mic as well.
I'll grab one of these.
I think this one is on.
Yep. So I need to share it to.
I think so. Yes. Let me just change the view. I wouldn't be seeing you on the Zoom.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Oh, okay, great.
And have you shared the slide?
Yeah, I have shared. Where? How do I do it so that it's just my slides and not my script that I'm not going to follow?
They're only seeing that.
We can only see the slides.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's all fine.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And, well, Andre's on the phone, but I will be thanking him later for that. That was an incredibly meaningful and moving presentation. So thank you. And thank you to Waylon as well. So my name is Gabby, and I will be presenting part of my PhD research that I'm doing here. But first I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, upon whose land we are standing right now, and this is where I'm conducting the research as well. And part of my, I guess, anti-carceral feminist approach is looking at prisons and policing and the whole carceral landscape as mechanisms of violent colonization and dispossession. I also need to give a content warning. So this presentation does contain potentially triggering topics. So are we talking about trauma, because we're talking about prisons, and my work focuses on women in prison. So there's a lot of talk about family violence, and I'll touch on deaths in custody and homelessness as well. So any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that there may be images and names about people who have died. If anyone's feeling uncomfortable at any time, I obviously will not be offended if you step out. So this is just a quick plan, pretty dry. I'll talk a bit about my project, the general overview, and then I'll be discussing some of the findings, very preliminary. I should probably state that this is a bit of a brainstorm in front of people, because I'm about halfway through, maybe a third of the way through my project right now. Yeah, so I'm very much just winging it, so I guess apologies in advance for that. Okay, so like I said, this is a PhD project in criminology. I'm in my second year, it's work in progress. It's a qualitative project with interviews, and I'm doing thematic analysis. So I've got a two-staged approach. The project overall is about women's experiences of remand and the challenges that service providers face working in that kind of liminal, very uncertain, very unpredictable space. So my two-staged approach is I've conducted interviews with service providers, and that's what we'll be looking at in this presentation. And part of those interviews, I consulted with service providers on how to ethically conduct interviews and work with women who have been criminalised, who have been released from remand. So I've got my ethics approved to do the stage 2 interviews like last week, so woohoo. And I will be starting that field work at the beginning of next year. So I'm sure we all know what remand is, but just in case, it is entering prison without being sentenced, so either before a bail hearing or if you've had bail denied and you're waiting for sentencing in your court proceedings. So that's why a lot of, I guess, the work and the thinking that I'm doing is about that state of like unpredictability and uncertainty and the pains that come along with that. So background, again, this is all things that you might know, so probably already know, so I won't spend too much time on it. I'm looking at remand, and Victoria is sort of in a remand crisis. I read that phrase a lot because of the bail law reform that occurred in the wake of the Burke Street massacre when James Gargasoulis drove his car through Burke Street, and there were a number of fatalities and he was out on bail. So there was then a widespread review of the bail laws in Victoria, and the reform ended up that, well, you know, the Andrews government or whatever got voted back in by being tougher on crime and not letting these dangerous people out into the community. Unfortunately, what then happened was that because the bail laws became so tight, a lot of people who might not have been imprisoned or got a custodial sentence for very low level offending were then put on bail, because bail became, I'm not going to get into like the legalities of it, but just very, very difficult to get and very difficult to argue for. And there were really very disastrous consequences. So Veronica Nelson Walker is an example that I guess I use when I talk about the rationale for my research, because she passed away as I was writing up my project and kind of developing the application for the PhD. And she passed away on remand in January 2020. And there was a coronial inquest into her passing this year. Sorry, it's been a long year. I don't know where we are. And yeah, so that was, I went to that coronial inquest, and there were just really, really harrowing details. And I guess the failing, or like just the lack of care that the prison was supposed to perform for women who were on remand became really clear in the course of those hearings. And this is a graph looking at the increase in sentenced and unsentenced women in Victoria. So you can see here just that the remand population went right up after the reforms came in. So that spike there. During 2020, it actually did drop a fair bit because I guess like magistrates and judges were a little bit more reluctant to put women on remand because it was seen as more punitive, because support workers and visits and all of that wasn't allowed. Unfortunately, since then, it has started creeping up again. And the last time I checked the statistics in Victoria, the maximum security women's prison had, I don't remember, 56% of the women in there were on remand. So it is quite a serious issue that I don't think that corrections and the prison operations have actually caught up with. And that's part of why I wanted to interview service providers who work in that space, because I think that I predicted, and I was correct, that they face a huge amount of challenges. So this is just a quick rundown of my literature review. So I've looked at, obviously, the broader literature on women's criminalisation experiences. And what I've read over and over and over again is that prison is very harmful to women because they are survivors of multiple forms of trauma. And also that women's experiences of remand are quite under-researched at this time. There's been a couple of publications, including Constellation of Circumstances by Emma and some other, where's Brie gone? She's gone. And some other colleagues Emma was supposed to present today, but that report was very formative for me when I was putting this project together. And also the Victorian Ombudsman found in 2017 that conditions for women on remand are quite distinct from sentenced women because they don't have access to programs, education, work. There are certain, I guess, health services that they can't access, like dental, which means that their time in prison is kind of quite restricted in terms of things that they can do, services that they can access, and it makes their experience quite distinct from sentenced women. I also looked at research with service providers, and that research told me that legal justice and correctional services are really overburdened, and that's both like government services and NGOs. So basically, service providers face really high levels of burnout, are constrained by the system, as I guess we just saw on the phone when the phone call got cut off. You know, that happens in here as well. And which I'm sure you can imagine is a huge problem for trying to like book appointments with people that you're working with on the inside. And the research with service providers also found that a lot of service providers believe that these really strict bail policies in Victoria are punishing and traumatizing women that they work with. And these are women who would not necessarily have gone to prison, say, 10 years ago. For whatever it is they are charged with. So these were my stage 1 research questions for the research with service providers. I had, what are the challenges that service providers face supporting women on remand? How do service providers conceive and perform their role in supporting women on remand? So I guess that was a little bit more about how they saw the role that they play in women's lives. And also what can experiences of service providers teach us about the realities of supporting women on remand? So that final question, I was kind of thinking more about like basically putting together recommendations that will support service providers in their work, because everyone that I've met and spoken to is extremely hardworking, really dedicated, very well-meaning, but like I said before, experiencing really high levels of burnout. And it just unfortunately means that like the sector loses really excellent workers that can make serious difference for people's lives, but they just don't have the support and the resources to do that. Theory and methodology, as Bronwyn introduced me, I do consider myself an anti-carceral feminist. So, you know, in an Australian context, that means looking at sort of settler colonial looking through a settler colonial framework. Sorry, that's what I was trying to say. And I think a lot about prison abolition. And yeah, I mean, anyone that was at the plenary yesterday with Debbie Kilroy and Tabitha Lean will have heard some of the stories about why thinking about abolition is really important in terms of building like stronger and more supportive communities. And as I also said before, I'm doing interviews and thematic analysis. So informed by appreciative inquiry, especially the service provider interviews, we've really been tried to take a sort of strengths-based approach with them and look for solutions that already exist, but maybe are not necessarily formalized. So ways that service providers work to support each other and to support women that they're working with. And kind of how I guess you can expand and apply those in a way that has more of a sort of cross-sectoral benefit. So I interviewed 20 participants and am transcribing and analysing those currently. So what I'm sharing is a snapshot from my preliminary analysis, but it is very preliminary, and the results will probably expand over the next year or so. So I've separated my findings into 3 themes, and I'll give you a moment to read those in just a second, those quotes. And the 3 themes, I didn't initially intend to name them after emotions, but as I was listening back through the recordings and reading back through my notes and the transcripts, the feelings in them were just kind of so big that I couldn't ignore them. So I've ended up naming the 3 themes that I'm presenting after feelings. So the first one we've got is frustration. And I've got 3 quotes up here. I know this is very wordy, but I felt like each of them kind of touched on different aspects of the frustration. So the first one with Tia, she's talking about how you lose people at court, and that's part of that uncertainty of remand. So a woman, her clients will go to court and they'll be released straight from court, but they won't have any post-release support. They won't have done any programs where they can engage with services while they're in prison, and they are completely unprepared, as she said, when they walk out of court. And essentially people like Tia, who want to be able to catch up with their clients and give them sort of long-term care, just can't. The second one's supposed to say Amanda, sorry, that's a typo. Amanda talked a lot about the challenges that COVID brought. So just endless tech issues, the prison, I guess, scale down operations in terms of sort of admin staff there, which meant that you couldn't book appointments, you couldn't just do anything. She talked a lot about not being able to get in contact with her clients and then needing to go to court on WebEx or whatever and show up for them and just having no idea where they were, how they were, or what was going on. And then Stephanie, the final one, talked a lot about burnout and how you need a lot of energy to work with clients who have really complex needs, but then all of these challenges discussed by Tia and Amanda just basically sapped all of your brain capacity. I'll give you a second to read over those, and then I'll show you my next thing. So the next one is rage, and this is just a longer quote from one person, Robin. And a lot of the service providers expressed this, but I thought that this segment from Robin's interview captured it really well. And I did initially call this theme anger. And if anyone saw me at the work in progress symposium day here a couple of months ago, this one was called anger in that presentation. But I ended up choosing to rename it as rage because there was something about this idea of rage. Firstly, because she says it makes her wild with rage, but I also felt like rage was more productive. Like there was something about the way that she talked about rage that really sounded like it drove her to fight for her clients and fight for change. And obviously I can't reveal who my interview participants were, but Robin is a really fierce activist who I really admire, and I was really stoked to do an interview with her. So I love this quote. I think it really captures what a lot of the service providers were communicating with me. So I'll give you a minute to read that one as well. And I also like her last line that they must know, because I feel like to a lot of probably us in this room, the problems presented by remand and by prison in general are just so obvious that they must know. Corrections, the department, the government, they must know. And it makes me wild with rage as well that people are still languishing and suffering. When there are people like Robin and the other people that I interviewed who are telling us what the solutions are and how we can help people. So on that, the final theme that I'm going to share with you is determination. So I've got 2 slightly different quotes here. One is a very beautiful one from Frankie, and Frankie has been working with women in prison for, I think she said, about 30 years. And I just thought that this quote was so lovely, that in the face of, all of the frustration and all of the rage that all of the service providers have felt, she loves her work and she loves working with women and she loves supporting them and helping them thrive. And helping them see their worth. And I just thought that was really beautiful. And it's that kind of, I guess, hope and joy and care and love from people like Frankie and that other interview participants expressed when I asked them, like, why is this work important to you? You know, you seem like you're just running up against a brick wall. Why do you keep doing it? That this sense of determination just keeps them going. And it really, I found it really inspirational as a researcher as well. And that quote from Alicia is what I've named my presentation after, that I try to be better than the systems that failed them, because I think that kind of captures everything really beautifully. And it also made me think that she's saying, you know, I try to be better than the systems, that there's also this kind of level of personal and individual responsibility that my interview participants have taken on themselves to fight against this huge system that has been failing the women that they work with for decades, years and years. You know, some of their clients have been wards of the state since childhood. And Alicia, who is probably about my age, has taken all of that on her shoulders and like feels like she's up against this system by herself for the sake of the women that she's supporting, which is sad on the one hand, but also just incredible that there are people like her out there. So to conclude, because I think I've only got 1 minute left, those are my very preliminary findings from my PhD thus far. And yes, women working with service providers experience frustration, anger, and fatigue, but a really incredible and beautiful determination to be there for the women that they work with. And I am, when I go further into my analysis, using anti-carceral feminism to look at these interviews and figure out, I guess, sorry, I should have written a better script for this, how anti-carceral feminism can be applied to looking at the experiences of women on remand and figure out how to support them, but also to support service providers to support them. And the next step for me is doing my interviews with women who have been on remand. So that will be, I'll be doing the recruitment and field work for that. Yeah, first semester next year, which I'm really, really, really excited about. That's my references in tiny font. Good luck. I'll send it to you if you want. Thank you so much.
Did we start with Zoom questions?
I was going to say also thanks a lot, Gabby. I think you said you'd be happy to take some questions directly after. Yeah. So if there are people who've got questions, please do say. And Raphael, I can also check whether there's any questions in the chat as well.
Oh, sorry. It seems like they couldn't see the slides on the end.
Oh, sorry. I thought I shared them to the Zoom, but yeah, I'm happy to send them around. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
The slides are they're coming into the chat.
I think there's no questions on the Zoom. It was all just...
Any questions here in the room? Oh yes, there's a question over a question at the back there.
Just wondering what questions are going to guide your work with the women, and like whether you are changing your approach or anything like that versus when working with service providers to work with women.
I think this one. Let's do the other one. Yeah, this is one.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, am I changing my approach? Well, not really, to be honest. Obviously, I'm asking different questions. They're kind of more about the women's experiences, and the questions guiding that are just very basically, what are the experiences of women who have been on remand in Victoria? No, I phrased that wrong, but it's about their experiences of remand, but also the second question I've got for the second stage is how are women's lives affected by time on remand? So yeah, in terms of my methodology, it'll be very similar, but I'll obviously be asking them, you know, how did you feel while you were on remand? You know, what did your typical day look like? What happened when you got out? That kind of thing. So very much just, I'm trying to keep them short, trying to keep them open, and just seeing where the participants want to take them, really. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
I think it's really wonderful work, and it's terrific the way you've located yourself theoretically, and congratulations. I just had a comment about using the word rage, which I think is fantastic. There's quite a lot of work written on critical rage theory, and so I'm wondering whether your use of the word rage is anchored in some of the theory that's come up with on questions of rage.
That's another excellent question, and the short answer is not yet. Like I said, this is very kind of preliminary, and the I guess talking about my themes as emotions, or like productive emotions, isn't actually something I expected to do. So I'm really glad you've asked that, because it's given me something that I can look into and that I will definitely be using. So thank you.
There is a question in the chat, and it says, any insights into what keeps support workers going? What sustains them doing this work?
Another good question. Thank you, Emma. So yeah, what sustains them doing this work is they talked about that it kind of boiled down to this idea of like someone's got to do it, so it might as well be me because I really care and I know I'm going to really try. That's kind of a paraphrasing sort of capture, but you know, they talked about how they think that criminalized women are some of the most, I guess, vulnerable and marginalized people in our communities, especially poor women of color who have been criminalized, and how there was just this real sense of like wanting to fight for those people and to be there for those people. And I think the more that service providers kind of met like-minded people, and there was that sense of collegiality, I guess, and that also really sustained them.
Okay, I don't know if any other questions. Okay, so any final questions? No other questions on the chat, and you will have seen, thanks a lot, Rafaela, that the slides are now available.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. And our third and final speaker for today's session is Liam Martin. So just a little bit of background before Liam takes over. Liam will be online. So Liam's research focuses on issues of incarceration and alternatives to prison. His book was published last year by New York University Press, titled Halfway House, Prisoner Reentry and the Shadow of Carceral Care. And this draws on long-term ethnographic fieldwork at a halfway house near Boston to examine the tensions of justice reform strategies that rely on shifting state punishment from prison into community settings. He is based at Victoria University in Wellington. So welcome, Liam.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bronwyn. And thank you to our other speakers for those sad stories of the brutalities of prison life in different parts of the world, in the US and in Australia, but also in some efforts to work within these systems to do positive things in prison education and the service providers that you're talking about, Gabby. There's some hope in there too. By a small world quirk, while I was doing the work that I'm going to talk about today, I was actually teaching through the Boston University prison education program, and taught sociology courses inside Norfolk State Prison, which was a profound learning experience for me. So I really appreciated hearing from Wayland, his willingness to come and speak to us and share his knowledge with us. And it took me back to that time, which was an important time for me. So my talk today, I'm going to switch a little from talking about prisons to thinking about alternatives, and I want to get us thinking about halfway houses. I'm going to talk a little about the kind of tensions between care and control at a halfway house near Boston, where I did ethnographic research, where I lived for 9 months altogether as a researcher, spread across 3 stays over a period of years, and was able to establish kind of long-term collaborative relationships with several of the men, particularly one of the men who I'm going to talk about today, and who kind of is really central in the book that came out last year. But I want to just start by getting us thinking about alternatives to prison and locating the halfway house in this decarceration moment that we're in, this moment of Black Lives Matter, struggles for decolonization and racial justice, a time when many people, policymakers, incarcerated people and their allies, ordinary people, are really looking for alternatives to prison, you know, really asking, what else can we do? And I want to ask us to think about, where does a halfway house fit within that? You know, like, is it a meaningful alternative to prison? And I ask you to think about this. Should we think about the halfway house as a tool for challenging carceral systems, providing desperately needed support to our people coming home? Or should we think of the halfway house as part of the system of mass incarceration, you know, part of the carceral system that itself needs to be challenged, dismantled, and so on? What do you think? So I'll just, as I talk, I'll ask you to kind of ponder that question. How do we think about the halfway house as we try to imagine alternatives to prison and so on? So my talk today is centered on the tensions between care and control at Bridge House, this program where I lived as an ethnographer, and that was shown in the photos on the last slide. On the one hand, it was a site of carceral control, you know. Almost all the residents entered as a condition of parole or probation. They were forced to live there, and their residents intensified the supervision of their community sentence, leaving them subject to random drug testing at the house, living under a curfew, and so on. The program also provided crucial supports, particularly housing, you know.
Liam, we can't see your slides, sorry.
That's because I didn't share them.
There you go. Thank you.
So there's the house there. Small program, around a dozen men living there at any one time. That's the porch there and so on. All right, I'll jump back in. So my talk is centered on the tensions between care and control at Bridge House, this program. On the one hand, it is a site of carceral control. On the other hand, providing crucial supports, particularly housing, you know, to people who are confronting often extreme forms of social exclusion outside. And I want to use the image of carceral care to think through the dual function of the house as both a site of state punishment and a site of social support and service delivery. To develop this, I want to organize the talk by sharing a little bit of the experience of my main collaborator, the man I call in the book Joe Badillo, and just to introduce how he arrived at the house, the crisis that brought him to the house. He had been cycling in and out of prison for much of his life, first sent to state prison as a 17-year-old and so on. In his late 30s, he contracted an abscess on his spine from heroin use. And when the abscess was surgically removed, they had to cut out some of his spinal cord. He was left paralyzed for a time. He ended up homeless and in a wheelchair, heavily dependent on heroin and other pharmaceutical opiates, eventually arrested using a stolen credit card to buy a TV from Walmart. He couldn't afford cash bail, so he spent 6 months locked up in the county jail. It was only a few $1,000s bail. He's stuck there, can't get the money for bail. But during that time, he actively maneuvers to get into the halfway house. He ended up taking a bad plea deal, basically, a long stretch of probation because it came with a halfway house placement. I showed up right around the same time he arrived at Bridge House. He was still getting around with the help of a cane, effectively learning to walk again. He made it very clear to me that getting a place in that house was a kind of lucky break, you know. A bed in a good program can be an incredibly important intervention in these moments. You know, Joe talked about it as even like a divine intervention. You know, God works in mysterious ways and so on, got me into the program. So we built a relationship over many years. You know, we did shared reading, we wrote together. He consulted with me throughout the writing of the book. We still talk, you know. Back then, when we first met, he made it very clear to me the importance of the halfway house, you know. And I have to say, I found it quite confronting. Before starting the field work, I had been reading a lot of Foucault, you know, thinking of a halfway house as a carceral space, you know, thinking of it as an extension of the prison into the community, the frontier of mass imprisonment and so on. And yet when I got there, I found Joe and other residents talking less about the carceral features of the place than the role of the program as an important resource, particularly housing, you know. Over time, I've had to work hard at thinking about these different elements together, you know, and the tensions between them. Support and sanction, care and control. And this is where I've come into the language of carceral care, you know, for thinking about the role of the house in the lives of the men who live there. These tensions can be traced to the rise of the halfway house in the US in the 1960s. You know, this was a time when Attorney General Robert Kennedy is advocating in an article in Crime and Delinquency. He's writing in Crime and Delinquency, the journal, you know, about the success of early pilots, halfway house pilots, and promoting the expansion of these institutions. A year after that article was published in 1965, the Prisoner Rehabilitation Act gave the US Attorney General, for the very first time, the authority to move federal prisoners into community halfway houses at any point in their sentence, even directly from court. It was legislation that redefined a place of confinement so that a person could now serve a sentence of imprisonment, not inside prison, but in the community. Now, the significance of this history is disputed if you read Stan Cohen, you know, like the classic text, Visions of Social Control. He presents the rise of the halfway house around this time as a paradigm case in the construction of a gigantic carceral net of community social controls. And in this version, the destructuring movement, challenging the place of the prison as the dominant mode of punishment, created its own structures of control, you know, like halfway houses that may have seemed like alternatives, but really expanded the problem they were intended to address. Still, I think we need to be cautious dismissing too easily these developments. 1960s criminal justice reform in the US was closely linked to broad-based challenges to racial caste. You know, this was a period of welfare state expansion, civil rights liberalization, you know, Civil Rights Act and so on, Voting Rights Act passed right around the same time as the Prisoner Rehabilitation Act. You know, this is a time when ideas approaching prison abolition were right in the mainstream. And this legislation to allow sentences of imprisonment to be served not in prison, but in halfway houses has this almost abolitionist promise in it. If we put ourselves in the shoes of that time, I think so much depends on what these programs would actually end up looking like and operating like. The first Bridge House was established in 1974 in Tennessee by a Jesuit priest and a group of student prison reform advocates. They lived alongside the released prisoners at the house, and they viewed their work as an exercise in social justice, built on the tradition of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement, showing hospitality to those on the margins and so on. This was the tradition of the Massachusetts house where I did my research too, the program director had lived for a year at a bridge house in Indiana while he was a student at Notre Dame. He was involved with Amnesty International and the anti-death penalty movement. And he saw this house as an extension of his social justice work, building an alternative to a punitive criminal justice system and so on. And yet the house was also inextricably linked to these more punitive sources of penal power. It was partly funded by the State Department of Corrections, for example. It held interviews with potential residents inside prison and jail. It was certified by the state to take probationers and parolees who again were forced to live there. You know, without the threat of prison as a backup sanction, some of the residents would have simply walked away. And one place where it very much mirrored the prevailing ethos of mass incarceration and the war on drugs was in a hardline stance on drug abstinence. It had this language of family atmosphere, supporting people and so on. And yet, if you failed a drug test or you failed a breathalyzer, you were evicted on the spot. And withdrawing someone's housing in these situations is incredibly disruptive and harmful. In other words, the support delivered by the program came in the form of this carceral institution. Bridge House was a site of carceral care. Perhaps the most unusual feature of the house was that it placed no time limit on stays, no formal time limit. So the program director called the common approach of most programs, cycling people through on, say, 30-day stays. He called that the factory model, you know, and at this program, at least formally, you could stay as long as you needed to. And so Joe Badillo stayed there for around 3.5 years. Part of this was about the collapse of alternative housing options. Joe was on a wait list for public housing for years and years, never got public housing. And in this context, the program provided a carceral alternative to the social safety net. You know, system of public housing collapsed, but there is a spot in a halfway house. You know, I think that says a lot about the structural context and where the money is. This support became especially crucial when the epidural cyst in Joe's spine returned. He was doing awesome. We had known each other for around 2 years at this time. It was a brutal medical crisis, you know, a shock. He had a second major surgery, this time removing even more of his spine. They cut open from the base of his spine to in between his shoulder blades, an enormous wound which they then left open because they were worried about the infection festering inside. He had surgery and months of physical rehab afterwards as the wound healed, and he slowly learned to walk again. This moment is a time where the halfway house support became utterly crucial. It became a life-saving intervention, you know. They held open his bedroom with all his clothes and his possessions stored as he left them during this whole period of surgery and inpatient rehab afterwards. They said, don't worry about it. You can come back here afterwards, you know. Crucial intervention. I came back for my final spell of field work right around the time that Joe got back from his surgery. And I saw up close, you know, the kind of crucial support he received there, you know. The house itself, crucial. Joe had been disabled and homeless before. He dreaded that happening again. It was his biggest fear. Stable housing also allowed for proper engagement with the healthcare system. He could plan and keep appointments with long wait times. He had a mailing address for receiving letters and a bedroom for storing his mountains of medical paperwork. I watched other men at the house wash his clothes, cook him food, make him cups of coffee. During a period of extremely restricted mobility, when he might have been isolated and lonely, there was always someone to talk to, and he was a central figure in the social life of the house day to day. In a whole range of ways, the house contributed to his physical recovery. And by the end of my 3 months there, that last time, he was walking again with the help of a cane. The price of the care provided at Bridge House was ongoing carceral control. Years after completing the probation sentence that first brought him to the house, he was still there. No longer forced to live there by a mandatory sentence provision, but in a way still stuck, you know, subject to random drug testing, living under a curfew, still located at the fuzzy edge between freedom and captivity. And there were ways in which the house disrupted his access to medical care, like when his doctor wanted to prescribe him Suboxone for chronic pain, and he said no, because he was worried about how that would be perceived at Bridge House. You know, this was a consequential decision. He lived with pain every day. During the summer after Joe's surgery, I recorded a conversation with him about the house. You know, we smoked cigarettes across an old picnic table in the driveway at the program, and just talked about the house. He was on the whole very positive, talking about the family atmosphere, the wide margin of freedom compared to other programs. He talked about being grateful to staff and volunteers who he said treated the men with dignity and respect. But there was also an ambivalence in his words. And I want to end my talk by sharing with you at length Joe's response when I asked him what it meant to call the program a halfway house. Exactly what it means, he said. You're halfway home. A halfway house originated from prison, where you go from maximum to medium to minimum to halfway house. This is more like a three-quarter house, meaning that you're close to just moving on to your own house or your family's house. Does it ever feel prison-like in that way, I asked. Joe paused to think and then continued. Anytime you're not in your home, it's going to feel like some kind of institution, even here. You can't have sleepovers. You got rules in place. Anytime there's rules involved, of course a convict's going to think about prison. Even though it's far from a prison, it's still got a prison mentality, as far as you got to follow rules and there's another person telling you what to do. And Bridge House does that. You have to be home at 10. You can't stay out late. You can't have people staying over. There's rules involved. And anytime I feel there's rules involved, there's a part of me is how can I get over? How can I manipulate the rules to work for me? So yeah, I think you could label it as a prison environment. Anytime there's somebody in authority telling you you have to do something, your instincts kick in. With Kevin, he's the operations manager at the house, being, even though he's not like a prison, you view him as a police because he's the one in charge of the rules. You can view Pat, the program director, as the warden that makes sure the prison runs right, makes sure it's funded. Then you got Kevin, who's in charge of discipline and making sure everybody abides by the rules. As lenient, as flexible as these rules are, there's still rules in place. In summertime, let's say my family wanted to go to the beach for the week. I wouldn't be able to go because I have to be home for suppers. Yeah, that's a big one. I have to be home every day. So I have to set my schedule, not according to me, but according to the house. Does that make sense? If I got plans, I got to make sure my plans don't interfere with the house. Whereas if I was home, I make my own plans. I'll be home when I get home. That's hard. I can't have a woman spend the night over here. If I do, I got to keep my door open like a teenager. So that's hard. It makes you feel like you're not home. That's when reality kicks in and you understand you're not home yet. Whenever you got to have a visitor, you got to have your door open. It's not home, man. As much as it feels like home, as much as it's saving people's lives, it's still not home. Home is home, man, where you can let the dishes pile up and not have to worry about discipline. Home is when you can come home, when you want to come home. And if you want to bring a girl home, that's home. I can't bring nobody here to spend the night. There's rules I got to follow. Just like in prison, there's rules you got to follow. I don't want to make it sound like it's a prison, but it is what it is, and it's not home. They make you feel like you're home, and they welcome you like it's your home, but it's not home.
That's time.
And that's me finished. I think also maybe just to say, I know we'll open up for questions now. I'm happy for the questions to be opened up to the panel. I know it's always a bit awkward trying to get interaction going over Zoom. So I'm happy to take questions, but I'm also happy for the questions to be directed to Gabby and Andre and have a more general panel discussion. But thank you.
Thanks so much, Liam, for that. That was very powerful. I think all of our speakers have been able to give some extraordinary insights into these aspects of care and incarceration, and in your case, the deep ambivalence around that idea of halfway house, halfway home. So thank you for that. I think perhaps if we begin with questions for Liam, just because it's first up on our minds, and I can see Andre's.
Yeah, Liam, I didn't realize your field work was so close to where I work. And I think one of the issues in these halfway houses, and I have currently some of my interlocutors in halfway houses. I think the problem that we face is certainly in the Bridge House, but the focus is for people who are on recovery from addiction, as you know, and you described. But so there are no appropriate, and I don't use the term halfway house. I talk about transitional housing, but there aren't actually appropriate transitional housing for people who are not needing a recovery that kind of way. So I'm just wondering, Liam, if you'd like to speak about this the situation of the halfway houses being so restrictive in terms of the population they seek to serve.
Recovery is everything, and recovery. So being clean, as a socially recognized category that defines your access to resources. So if you can pass a drug test and be recognized as clean, you can get access to housing. You can get access to other kinds of support. If you can't, you are excluded, and how those judgments get made can be, they are incredibly consequential for people in these spaces, and inherently ambiguous, around, where's the line? So one thing for Joe, where's the line between pharmaceutical medication and illegal drugs, when you're someone who's dealing with chronic pain, and there were people on very strong pharmaceutical drugs who could still pass drug tests and be recognized as clean, and others who, fail a breathalyzer for drinking alcohol and are evicted for that. So that was one of the things that really, really struck me during the field work, was that I didn't expect, was how recovery and notions of clean and dirty organize so much of what's happening in the network of programs that this house was within. Within this neighborhood, there's a whole bunch of programs, and it's like, this clean and dirty and recovery is organizing so much of the social life.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. I had a question here.
Thanks, Liam. Yeah, I really struggle with holding the complexity of this stuff, but it is really important. I'm just wondering, since you have finished up your field work, have any of the men that you've worked with found a sense of home anywhere? Or are they still in this kind of limbo space?
Well, the main collaborator, Joe, who I talk about in the talk, he has done amazing. Like, his story is, what I shared today is a little snippet of what is just an amazing story, So he now runs an addiction recovery drop-in center. in that neighborhood, same neighborhood he grew up in, same neighborhood where he was, you know, out in the streets and so on. Now he's socially recognized as clean. He's a licensed drug and alcohol counselor, and he's bought his own house. You know, like it's a story of amazing transformation where he's gained social stability, salaried employment, housing. You know, he bought a house, but it's also incredibly liminal. Like he's still in that in-between space. You know, he's every day in the same neighborhood with the same, you know, it's his connections in the neighborhood that make him so well suited to his job. You know, he's known, he knows people, he can mobilize people. Yeah, so like, yeah, there's a real, I think his story really gets at the ambiguity. I think that was one of the main mobility pathways I saw, was to seek employment within the network of programs, you know, and I saw people doing that really successfully. But then that's also a very kind of liminal location, even if you gain kind of stable employment and so on in that space. I hope that answered your question.
Can I just have a follow-up question? Sorry. And so now that he's working in that space, having that lived experience of how kind of coercive and kind of black and white the approaches can be, yep, does he then have to kind of bring that exact same practice into his work, or does he bring, I guess, a different way?
He's interesting. There's definitely moments where he pushes back, you know. So at the Addiction Recovery Center that he runs, for example, they have a model they call all recovery, where they don't give out medallions for clean time, for example. You know, this thing of like AA and NA, the 12 steps, this was the model that really dominated in the space. And it's like, you're either clean or dirty and you accumulate time. You know, I've been clean since this date, and like there's no in between. It's just a straight binary. When we know, you know, these things are fuzzy and ambiguous. What drugs are allowed and so on. You know, like, you know, you're allowed to smoke cigarettes. You know, there's a lot of cigarette smoking. You're allowed to drink coffee. You know, but so at the center that he runs, he's done away with the 12-step model, and he does what they call all recovery, which is a much more forgiving approach, where they leave it up to people to decide much more, you know, what the road to recovery looks like and so on. But you know, this wasn't the period when I was doing the field work, was when he was doing this work, because it would be interesting to know where his attempts to do things differently butt up against the system, you know, and the way that the system kind of enforces particular ways of looking at what it means to be successful and so on.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Some of you may be able to see it. So thanks, Emma. I'll just read it out. So really fascinating and nuanced research. Liam, thank you for sharing. I'm curious to know a bit more about the official authoritative discourses that circulate around halfway houses and legitimize them. What are their purported goals? How are these articulated? Do they focus on individuals only or on systemic change too?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm just trying to think about the angle to come at it from. I think halfway houses is something that encapsulates an enormous amount of diversity. So one thing I would say is, like, you know, when people talk about supporting halfway houses, what are we talking about? So, you know, if you want to Google it, there was a series in the New York Times a while ago about halfway houses in New Jersey. Some of these places had 1,000 people in them. They look like prisons, you know. You can't have a halfway house with 1,000 people in it. You know, that's not a halfway house that I would imagine. So, and they're for profit. They're run by a for-profit company, which was closely related to Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, and so on. So now they've got a discourse of what a halfway house is, which I think is very much focused on individual transformation, you know, and how are we going to fix people coming through these spaces, you know. But there's other ones which are more, you know, the Bridge House model going back, it comes out of Catholic Worker House model, which does have a more like socially transformative ethos and so on, you know. And there's other models which I mean, linked in with prison education. You know, I've seen a place in New York which was led by some African-American scholars at New York University, closely linked in with prison education and supporting people with housing who post-release who are also engaged with university education. And their discourse of what a halfway house is and doing is very systemic, you know, very much about building leaders who can contribute to systemic transformation and so on. So yeah, I think it's probably like maybe there's diverse discourses and it's paying attention to like who's speaking and yeah. I hope that answered your question, Emma.
Thank you. We've just got a couple of minutes for any other questions. First of all, if anyone on the panel wanted to respond or comment on anything we've heard, and or whether the people who are here or online would like to ask any other questions of any of the speakers.
Thanks, Liam. I thought it was really excellent, really interesting. Yeah. Liam and Gabby, I just wanted to say that I thought your presentation was excellent. It was really interesting and very moving. And I guess if you're still in, I'm sorry, I can't actually remember his name, but if you're still in contact with Joe.
Oh, Joe, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose pass on our best.
Thank you.
Sounds like a really impressive person.
He is.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers. Emma, I hope you're feeling better soon. It's been an incredibly constructive, thoughtful, rather inspiring set of papers today. So thank you all very much. I'm sure those of you who are here, it's a bit of an opportunity, fortunately, to stop around and have a chat and so on. Liam, unfortunately, we can't do that with you in Wellington.
And yeah, New Zealand. Yeah, on Wellington, New Zealand. Yeah.
But great to see you, and thanks to all those who've been online as well. We'll finish up now. Thank you.